So welcome to this webinar, WealthWorks for Building Rural Economies. We wanted to start out a little bit with just a description of WealthWorks. I know a number of you on the call are familiar with this work, and there are a number of you on the call who perhaps are not as familiar. So this is kind of an introductory / review webinar. And WealthWorks is really about what it says here on this lovely slide, improving the livelihoods of people and places that have been economically marginalized. And we do that by creating wealth through market interactions. And the wealth, we're creating wealth that is owned, controlled, and reinvested in place by and for the benefit of people who have been heretofore economically marginalized. That's the basic picture and intent of WealthWorks. It's connecting community assets to market demand for lasting livelihoods. So this webinar that we're providing today is in 5 parts. And it is being recorded, so hopefully it will be there for the people who are unable to join us today. Part 1 is what is WealthWorks. Part 2 is what is wealth. Part 3 is what does it mean to be demand-driven. Part 4 is what is a WealthWorks value chain. And Part 5 is how do we get from exploration of a WealthWorks value chain to proof of concept. And Barbara and I will kind of be alternating our voices in this presentation, so hopefully you won't get too much of either one of us. I'm going to take part 1, which is what is WealthWorks. WealthWorks, essentially, one way to think about what it is as a bridge between community development and economic development, where community development is generally about voice and empowerment, and it uses organizing strategies to achieve those outcomes. It tends to be issue-based, and it tends to be often somewhat confrontational. Conventional economic development is, in this country, about creating jobs. That's the metric we use to know if we're doing economic development. And it's creating jobs by attracting businesses through tax breaks and incentives. It can also include supporting entrepreneurs or strengthening existing businesses. Neither one of these approaches, whether it's community development or conventional economic development, actually takes a systems approach to the development of communities and economies. Neither one of them actually addresses the underlying dynamics of economic exploitation by offering an alternative approach to market connections. Neither one explicitly connects economic, social, and environmental conditions and opportunities. And neither one specifically is based around the idea of engaging people based on their value propositions, which is something we will be talking more about today. WealthWorks is a bridge between those two things. It's trying to take the best of economic development and the best of community development, add a twist, and bring them together so that the goals of each can be achieved more holistically. WealthWorks is fundamentally about changing systems. It's not just about doing a project or having a short-term impact. It's about really changing systems for ongoing sustainable impact. And so I thought that it would be useful to tell you a couple of just very short stories about systems changes that have resulted from people using WealthWorks as a framework on the ground. But first, let me just say what I mean by systems change. Really, it's about this is the way that things are done today. This is the normal. And then through WealthWorks, we have an opportunity to envision and then to create and implement a new normal. So if you look at the little brown box, farmers and groups of farmers work together to meet market demand, benefiting farmers, youth, and communities. When WealthWorks started, there were a number of different groups, and this is in the South, in the Deep South, that were involved in one way or another in agriculture, but they didn't work together. They didn't know each other. None of them were really connected with wholesale market demand. They were maybe working, growing for farmers markets or growing for very local markets. Youth were not involved. There was a lot of underutilized land. And through the development of a WealthWorks value chain, a series of value chains, those things are beginning to turn around. So the system by which folks are interacting with each other, by which they're engaging their land and their youth, and by which they're reaching out to markets of a different kind than they ever had before, is really being changed. In the pink box with another example, utility companies, when this particular situation began, the utility companies were very interested in producing more and more power. This is in Central Appalachia, which is coal country, and the utilities are mostly make their money by selling more and more power, building more and more coal-fired power plants. And they really had no interest at all in efficiency. In Kentucky, they have among the lowest electric rates in the country, but among the highest electric usage because of no attention to efficiency. And so instead, a system is being built there in which utility companies are supporting energy efficiency options and making them available to low-income households because they realized that their households were having a hard time paying their bills. And that was not a pleasant situation for them to be in because they're rural electric co-ops, their members are their households, and they didn't want to be at odds with their membership, and so they realized that they had some vested interest in improving efficiency. And that partnership between them and a nonprofit organization has begun to change the system through which those energy efficiency improvements can be made available that couldn't be made available at the beginning. And at the last one, the green one, is a story about biofuels. When the situation began, there was no real biofuels production happening in the communities in the Delta in Arkansas, and they were buying and importing their fuel just like all the rest of us do. And now there's a system for creating fuel from used waste oil and soon from a crop that's being planted by local farmers, camelina, to be able to help municipalities grow their own, use their own, keep those dollars circulating locally. So those are three quick thumbnail sketches of what we're talking about when we're talking about systems change. Just a word about the history of WealthWorks. This is an initiative that has been under development now for a little bit over 7 years. And it's been ground truth. It's involved over 60 different organizations in testing and development and research and conceptualization. The first 2 years of this work were really about the conceptual development of the WealthWorks framework and the principles and the ground truthing to understand what was already happening in the world and where we could add value. And then there was about a year of exploration on the ground for different groups in different parts of the country. And then there have been up to 4 years of actual implementation with value chains actually being constructed, product moving through them, revenue moving back in the other direction. So while this hasn't been going on for decades and decades, it has certainly, I think, been ground truthed to an extent at this point. These are the regions in which this work has been was started. Central Appalachia in the sectors of energy efficient housing, energy efficient retrofits, renewables, food, forestry, and healthcare. The Black Belt of Alabama and the Mid-South, biofuels, social impact investment, forestry, food, community-based tourism, arts and culture. The lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, green housing and healthcare. And then now it's beginning to spread around the country through groups like RCAC and others who are being trained and beginning to bring this home to communities in upwards of 20 additional states besides these. So part of the purpose of this slide is to help you see not only that there's geographic spread, but that there's spread across sectors. This is a framework that can apply in any number of sectors. It's not limited just to one or two.
Great. All right. Get ready. Roll up your sleeves. We're going to talk about what is wealth. So wealth is a foundational concept to this whole approach. It's about building different forms of wealth or different capitals. So let's look at what those are, those different forms of wealth. So, Donna? Great. I guess I could have done that. All right, so what do we mean by wealth? Wealth is, how do we usually think about wealth, right? These dollar bills, or $100 bills in this case. We usually focus on the financial aspect, but we break it down into 7 or 8 different forms of wealth that communities have and want to build and increase. So what is it really? It's the stock of all assets. It's without the liabilities that can contribute to the well-being of an individual or a group. It is durable and can be accumulated And also it can be depleted. It can be accumulated through investment. It can be depleted through consumption decisions. And also wealth naturally will deplete if you don't invest in it. Wealth generates flows of goods and services that contributes to the well-being. So we're going to talk in a minute about the difference. Two of the key words on this slide is stock and flows. So we're going to talk about those next. So what is the difference between a stock and a flow? A stock is what we build up and are able to use in the future. So let's think about this bathtub as our stock of capital. And then there's two ways to grow our stock. One way is investment. So we can invest to increase the stock. And the other one is, so that's how we can build a stock. The way we use our stock is we make consumptive decisions. We use what's in the bathtub. So that flows out. We consume our stock. So what's the difference between a stock and a flow? So a stock is what is accumulated in the bathtub, and a flow is what runs through it. So using income, for an example, we get a job, we get some income, and then we spend that income on some products. In fact, maybe those products have even been built overseas or in some other part of the country. In that example, that is a flow of the resources. It comes into the bathtub and it flows out of the bathtub itself. A stock is where it gets stuck in the bathtub and it builds up in the bathtub. So it could be building up because we're investing or because we're consuming less, and actually it's a matter of looking at both at the same time. So we want to plug the leak at the bottom of the bathtub, but then also keep investing. So that's sort of the difference. Now, of course, we're going to consume, right? In fact, we want to consume. We want to use our wealth to increase community well-being and individual well-being. So what becomes critical is that part of that we don't just consume, but actually we reinvest. And that is like investing back into the bathtub. And I don't know, as really people around the world, but particularly as Americans, we do a great job of consuming, and we don't always reinvest, where both are important to build our stock of wealth. All right, so what are the different forms of wealth? So I said, there's different, it's not just money, there's some different aspects. So what are the different forms? There's intellectual capital. Intellectual capital refers to creativity, new ideas, the ability to, I actually think these are defined in a later slide. So we'll just go over the names here and then we'll define them. So intellectual capital, social capital, individual, then we have natural, built, political, which is similar to social, we'll talk about that, financial, and cultural capital. So what are these different, let's define these different forms of wealth. So the next slide shows the 8 forms. There's intellectual capital, the stock of knowledge, innovation, and creativity or imagination. And then there's social capital is the stock of trust and relationships and networks that support society. And then the last one on this page is individual capital, which is the stock of skills and health of people in a region. So those 3 are foundational to the other ones, which we'll talk about in a second. A lot of times I get asked a question, what's the difference between intellectual and individual? And I like to say that I know plenty of people that have a lot of great ideas, but they really struggle to carry them out. They don't have the skills to carry them out. Likewise, a lot of people that are very skilled, but it's a challenge to think bigger picture in new ideas. So they both go together. They're both really critical, but they're not the same thing. Okay, so what are the other ones? We have natural capital, which is the stock of unimpaired environmental assets in a region. And to talk about this one for just a minute, what's that word unimpaired mean? A lot of times I'll talk to people, what kind of wealth do you have? And they'll say, oh, well, we have the river, we have some wood, maybe some woods or some soil. The question is it productive? And they say, well, no, the river's polluted, the soil's really lost its nutrients, so then it's actually not an asset for you. It's not really capital or wealth unless it can be productive. So impaired, obviously, is when it's not being productive, and then we count unimpaired environmental assets. The next one is built capital, which is the stock of fully functioning constructed infrastructure. And this one is not only buildings, roads, kind of hard infrastructure, but it's also broadband and access to computers and aspects of sort of the internet highway that's also considered built. And then the last one is, well, second to last, political capital is the stock of power and goodwill that is held by individuals, groups, or organizations that can be held or used to achieve desired ends. So this isn't what political party you are. It's not just policies or governmental policies. For example, when a group of farmers got together and worked with Walmart to change their policy around buying from local farmers, they used their political capital to change the practices of Walmart in an area to achieve their desired ends. So it's not just federal policies or political parties. And then there's financial capital, is the stock of unencumbered monetary assets that we can use to invest in the other forms of capital or in financial instruments. So to understand this one a little bit more, this is really the capital, the money that we have that's available. It's not the money that's tied up. It's available to be invested in education. You use it to pay for an education. That would be using your financial capital to build both individual and maybe build intellectual and maybe even a little individual along with that. Financial capital, you could use that to change your forestry management practices so your forest as a whole is healthier and is more sustained over a longer period of time. So financial capital is a tricky one because it's really about what you can use it for in terms of investing in the other forms of capital. So cultural capital is the one that actually many people feel very comfortable with. It's the stock of the practices that reflect values and identity. That's about a place. It could also be about place or class or ethnicity. In WealthWorks, cultural capital is seen, it's built or maintained through investments in the other 7 forms of capital. So for example, the tribe that has a language retention program is working to bring back a language and have it be in use. That certainly looks like cultural capital. It is cultural. It's bringing back practices and language from the past that's part of that tribe's identity. But actually what happens is it's taught through a skills program. It's about individuals who have the skills in that language or the knowledge of those practices. So it's actually seen through another one of the capitals, which would be individual. Or here there's an example, quilting in Gee's Bend. It's actually about the skills of maintaining those skills in the next generation. So all of these forms work together. We try to build all of them without undermining any of the other. So one of my examples is of this, actually in this case, kind of a large store, box store, built their store up on the top of a hill and paved over a nice big parking lot for the store, and everyone was very happy because look, now we have jobs, we have increased access to goods, and it looked really good until the first rainstorm, when all the rain on that now impermeable surface of the parking lot resulted in flooding in the houses that lived down below, actually in that case low-income houses that lived down below from this big store. So they might have built some, they increased their built capital for sure. Maybe they might have had an impact on financial capital, but at what cost? And the cost was very much on environmental, but also on the built of the homes and the finances of the people who now had to repair their basement. So we try to see this as a system, how these are all together, and by being really intentional about it, which so often we're not intentional about it, and we hear that this is one of the best parts about having these different forms of capital clearly explained, is that it helps people be intentional in building these different capitals. And I'll just say one last thing about the wealths, which is we use this framework about understanding the wealths primarily in 3 different ways. The first is as an assessment. What do we have? What do we have that's underutilized? What's impaired? Where's our bathtub almost empty? Where could we increase it? So certainly an assessment phase. Then we definitely use it for planning. So I will go to that when we talk about value chains, but how are we going to proactively increase these wealths? And then we also use it for measurement, so we can see the impact of our value chain on all of the wealth, not just usually we count jobs, and that may not even be increasing any of the wealth. So it's very useful in those ways. So we need enough of every form of wealth so that we can impact, we can consume, for sure, there's benefit directly from the income, but also so we can reinvest and grow our wealth over time. Great.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. Before we move on to this next part 3, are there any questions about what we mean by wealth? Okay, no questions. I hear no questions. If you've muted yourself, you can unmute yourself. Okay, we'll keep going then. So the next part of this webinar is about what does it mean to be demand-driven. WealthWorks is all about connecting to market demand. That's really where it starts. It starts with identifying those market-based opportunities for systems change, and that's a new way of thinking. Whether you're a community developer or an economic developer, people don't tend to think about what market-driven change looks like. If you're trying to attract a business, you're not really thinking about the markets that business sells things around, so that you're better off and someone else then is worse off. Those jobs would have been someplace else if they weren't where you've attracted them. So that's not a systems way of thinking, and it's not a way of thinking that really goes deep into connecting with market demand. So the answers to being demand-driven, what that means, are not always obvious, and that's why this is an ongoing process of exploration. There are 3 fundamental approaches to thinking about demand, right? And demand is about what consumers want, but it's also about what the people who serve consumers want. So in this work, we're often talking about the invisible demand, that is to say the people who buy at wholesale and make sure that when you go to the store, the thing that you're looking for is actually there. The buyers that we're usually working with in a WealthWorks context are those wholesale buyers, not the end consumers. So there are 3 approaches to demand. One is to meet existing demand. So when there's already a buyer out there who says, we really need more lemons. You know what a lemon is. The buyer knows what a lemon is. It's a matter of getting them more of what they already know they want and need. The second one is to make ineffective demand more effective. Ineffective demand means, it's a term that economists use, and it means when people want something but they can't afford it. They don't have the money, and therefore you don't see their demand in the marketplace because they simply can't enter the marketplace. They can't afford what they would want if they could. So the example I gave you earlier about making energy efficiency affordable by low-income households, that was a way of making ineffective demand effective. And I'm not going to talk in detail about the mechanism, but that was the idea there, that that happen. And the third approach to demand that's really prevalent in the world we live in today is creating new demand, creating through innovation, creating things that people didn't even know they could want because they didn't exist until you created them. All three of those approaches to demand can be part of WealthWorks. So an example of meeting existing demand, the groups, the agricultural groups in the South, going by the name of Deep South Community Agricultural Network, and they, by the way, have a website that I would invite you to visit that tells their story. They are providing agricultural products, and they've actually done a couple of things. They've created some new demand as well as met existing demand. So one of the things that they've grown are collard greens. There's existing demand for collard greens, and they're helping to meet it. Another thing that they grow are sweet potato greens, and actually there wasn't that much demand for sweet potato greens until they began to present them to the market, and the market realized how good they were, and so they've been creating some markets that didn't exist before. The second example that I was going to tell about ineffective demand was the one about the utilities, and so we've gone through that. The third one is creating new demand through innovation, and one example of that from the WealthWorks value chain is Rural Action, which has been creating some new wood products. They have a product called stack wood that they make from waste boards, and they've turned them into, in essence, a wall covering, so that you can cover your wall with wood and make a very interesting kind of texture and environment out of any interior wall using their stack wood. And that was something that they invented, and they're finding now that people are interested in it. So that came about through their engagement with their value chain. So another piece, really important piece of demand is understanding interests and value propositions. And in this work, we talk about three kinds of interests. First kind of interest is self-interest, which is all about what's in it for me? What will I get out of it? If I am a woodworker, why would I want to be part of this value chain? Well, maybe I'd want to be part of it because it's going to open up some new market opportunities for me. Or maybe I want to be part of it because it's going to introduce me to other producers who can help me make new products. So understanding the self-interest of every person and every group involved in WealthWorks in your particular value chain is really important, because people will only stay involved in things over the long run if they're going to get something out of it, and if they can see what that something is. So the role of value chain coordinators, which we'll also talk about a little later, is really in part about helping people articulate and understand their self-interest and then understand everyone else's self-interest. Excuse me. Out of that process comes the second concept of shared interest. Is there something in it for you and for me that gives us a shared interest in a successful outcome? So we were recently listening to a report on a WealthWorks value chain around food and health. And a hospital is basically sponsoring a CSA for low-income households by paying farmers for the products that are being delivered through that CSA. So there's something in it for the farmers. They're getting an income stream for the products that they grow. And there's something in it for the hospital because they're able to help families be healthier, and that helps their bottom line. So that's an example of a shared interest. Common interest is an interest in the common good that we think about typically as kind of an altruistic interest, or an interest in something like a cleaner environment, or reducing the amount of poverty in a region. It's not as narrow necessarily as self-interest or shared interest. It's a broader interest. And those broad interests are great, but the thing to understand about this work is it does not require everyone to share a sense of the same sense of the common interest. What it does require is that everyone engaged see some benefit to themselves from being engaged. And in our experience, through developing using a WealthWorks framework, people come to see more and more shared interests. Folks who may not have begun thinking they had any shared interests may discover that in fact they do, and that they're comfortable working together to try to achieve those shared interests. So the first piece to developing relationships with demand is really understanding what is the value proposition for the buyer. What does the buyer of the good or service that your value chain is going to produce, and we'll talk about the value chain a little bit more in a minute, what is it that they're really looking for? Are they looking for something that meets a particular set of specifications? Are they looking for something to help them solve a pain point? So one of the things we've learned from one of the people we've worked with in this work is that McDonald's has a pain point. McDonald's pain point is that people who go there feel guilty. So McDonald's needs some help figuring out how to make the experience one not of guilt but of pleasure, right, of enjoyment. And so if you can figure out a way to partner with them to help them address that pain point, they're going to be interested in talking to you. What are the opportunities that the buyer sees to reach out to new markets? What are the things that if they could only get their hands on would help them serve their customers better? Maybe their customers are looking for something that could be a digital version and they don't have that to offer, but your value chain could help them turn what they do into something digital that would better meet the needs of their buyers. So when you're building a relationship with a buyer, you need to think about what you want to ask the buyer. And as those of you who've been to the training will remember, we spent quite a bit of time doing role plays with buyers. And one of the lessons was that when you're meeting a buyer and trying to establish a relationship, you're not trying to sell something to that buyer. You're not saying, here's what I've got, will you buy it from me? What you're trying to do is really understand what the world looks like from the buyer's perspective. What would make their life more successful? What would help them solve their pain points? What would help them open up new markets? And if you understand their perspective, then you're much better able to figure out how your resources, your forms of wealth, and the other things you have to work with can be organized and designed into something that they will want to, in fact, buy. So important things to think about are the information that you are going to want to share with the buyer when you talk to them about who you are and your values and the values of your value chain, what you're trying to achieve. And then to start to think about what a partnership with a buyer might look like. So instead of thinking of a buyer as simply an individual or an organization who pays you for what you've got, begin to think about your buyer as a co-creator. How can you work with your buyer as a partner in figuring out how to create those things that are going to be good for you and good for the buyer?
Great, thanks. I also just want to add, on this self-interest, it's definitely what's in it for me. Absolutely, that's the question to ask. But sometimes what's in it for me is meeting the goals of my organization. So it may not be what's in it for me, how will I as an individual benefit. It could be how I will be able to do even a better job of meeting the goals of my work or my organization through this value chain. So just kind of adding a little nuance to that self-interest. Okay, so what is a WealthWorks value chain? So this is in addition to the thinking about the wealths and a matrix about the wealths, this is the second tool that we really use in this approach, is the value chain. So the definition of a WealthWorks value chain, it's a business model, and it's based on shared economic, social, and environmental values. Again, shared, not everyone has to have common, in which buyers, processors, producers, and others, like support partners, work together for mutual benefit to create value in response to market demand. And Sean has just talked a lot about market demand, while building community wealth. So it's this economic model that responds to market demand and builds community wealth at the same time. So how does that come about? So let's just step back for a second and just talk about value chains a little more generally, and then we'll get back to WealthWorks value chains. So we start with the transactional partners, the people that play a direct role in getting the product or service to market. So these are going to be suppliers, producers, aggregators, distributors. These are the people that if any of them didn't exist, you wouldn't be able to get that product or service to market. You wouldn't be able to consume it. You wouldn't be creating value. So those are the transactional partners. But we also, because we're using looking at the whole system, we're also talking about, well, who are the supporting partners? Who are the people that are required to provide support to those transactional partners so they can actually achieve what they're setting out to do? So if that could include businesses, technical assistance, financing, policy, research, capacity building. It's the things that are needed to produce the product or remove barriers to the product getting to market. So a lot of times, just as you'll see a great business, a wonderful enterprise that's thought about even their demand partners producing a product for market, but in fact there's a policy that's a barrier. There's something that stands in their way. And they haven't been looking at that because they didn't look at the whole system. And then the last one, here's some value chain maps. So this is very generic, and we're going to show some examples of on the ground ones as well. But first we say, so as Shauna said, this is demand driven. So we kind of have an idea about what we're talking about. What are we talking about? What kind of product or service we might be talking about. So the very first thing is there demand for that product or service? And what does that look like? And what are they actually looking for? It might not be exactly what we're thinking, so we want to get on the same page. We want to fit between what demand is looking for and what we have to offer. Then who are the people or the organizations that are needed, the businesses, to get that, that product or service to meet that demand? So those are the blue transactional partners. And then we add last the supporting players on the side, and who are they that are needed. So we do this because so often, you know, we invite the supporting players first. We invite the people we know. If we're a nonprofit or a community organization, we invite the people that we know, that are our friends or our colleagues we've been in other meetings with, and we start with the support partners. But the challenge is we may not have the ones we really need at the table, because we don't know who we need until we know who the transactional partners are and what their needs are. So in a way, the supporting players are also being demand driven. They're responding to the transactional players and what their needs are. But everybody, we're going to look at some of those pictures, but all of these folks are in the value chain map. They're all part of the value chain system, but sometimes they all get together at once. A lot of times they're subgroups working to problem solve a specific issue. And there's examples of that. Okay, so let's look at some of the value chain maps from the ground. So this is this should look familiar to a couple of you anyway. This is the Northern New Mexico Food Hub Network, and you can see where we have the producers, processing, and then we have the consumer retail. And importantly, and I forgot to point this out in the last slide, there's often a coordinator who helps facilitate the communications up and down this value chain, who helps to bring in different players that are missing and to help facilitate problem solving. And we'll go over the roles in a minute of a coordinator, but in this case, the hub is really the coordinator of all of this. Okay, and another one is,
Oh dear.
There we go.
Technical difficulty.
Oh, you have to close the program.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, let's see what I can do to get this back up and running, guys. Sorry.
That's all right. I can also keep talking. We'll come back and look at the couple other, we have a recreation, tourism value chain as well as sort of a more specific. But I want to, while Shauna's doing that, is it back up? Oh yeah, that was fast.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm impressed. Okay, so here's the recreation tourism. We have a bunch of aggregators, and in this case, what we mean by aggregators is who is aggregating the tourists. Remember, Shauna said in the beginning about demand partners. The amount of time and energy it would take for us to reach out to every individual consumer would be huge. So we go through demand partners that are aggregating those consumers, that are bringing them together. So in the food industry, for example, that might be the wholesale level. It's the person that's providing the food to multiple retail outlets. In the tourism business, we're aggregating those consumers through things like a bus tour company, different marketing outlets. There's some over here in the red. Tourism bureaus, different ways that we aggregate demand, or consumers, but these become demand partners. And then we've got the other transactional partners, and in the yellow. The green is the kind of services we would be offering, and then in the purple we've got some of the supports and some of the other things that are happening around that. So purple is existing events, yellow is transactional partners, red is demand, and green are the resources we have. You can see that there. Okay. There we go. So in this one, we've got our transactional functions across the middle. We've got our demand partners in the red over on the side. And then we have our support functions at the top. So we see financing, capacity building, education. And then across the bottom is some of the assets that are underutilized. So going back to the different forms of wealth, this group in Michigan looked at the different natural assets that were there, that were productive and useful, but they weren't being used in the tourism value chain. So that's a great opportunity there for increasing production. Okay. So just a quick talk about the difference between supply chains, value chains, and then a WealthWorks value chains. So supply chains push a product to market. Somebody makes a great thing, a great widget, and says, all right, now I've got to convince people to buy my widget. It's beautiful, it's small, it's red, I have a great widget. And I'm going to go and I'm going to sell this to everybody and convince them to buy my widget. So each way up the supply chain, I'm convincing the next person they need what I have. And in a supply chain, we tend to see we try to buy low and sell high. It's about maximizing our benefits to us. We also we don't have often very good communications. We're only communicating with the next person up in the chain, or the person that we're buying from in the chain, because we're not seeing the whole picture. We just want to sell to the next level in the chain, whether it's the aggregator or the wholesaler to the retailer. But it's pushing this product and selling it and convincing people to buy it. So in a value chain, it's more demand-driven. It's more the pull of the product. We find out what is needed on the demand side, and then we respond to that. So we're working in partnership, as Shauna said, co-creating. So we're producing something that's wanted by the demand partners, and we're not having to push it so hard, but it's actually being pulled. But a traditional value chain, Michael Porter's value chain, focuses a lot on increasing just financial profitability and talks about adding financial value to each step in the chain. So you'll hear a lot about value-added products. So instead of just selling wood as a big old tree, and we know the stump price is sort of the cheapest price, there's different ways to add value to that, whether it's drying it, turning it into violins, whatever. So it focuses on capturing the financial profitability at each stage of the value chain. But the key word there is it's just financial profitability. A WealthWorks value chain uses a series of steps to find opportunities to produce a range of values. So those range of values is often reflected in the 7 forms of wealth. We use a WealthWorks value chain to increase and invest in the different forms of wealth. And also, when it's fully functioning, the value chain can contribute to that common set of values. So it's increasing values for each of us, but also that greater, the greater good, or that sense of altruism. So it's sort of the chain. They're different: supply, value, and now WealthWorks value chain. Okay, we're almost done with this part. So what's the difference about a WealthWorks value chain? The first is, we've talked a lot about response to demand. Demand for the product or service, and demand for the secondary benefits, which is often the additional, the common benefits. So I'll just give a quick example. The playground and the after-school program, the product or service was a great place for kids to go. A lot of people cared about that. They wanted the kids off the street. They actually started to talk about nutrition, education, and served healthy snacks. And so you started to have the kids were healthier, they were playing outdoors, they weren't just staring at a computer screen. And so the secondary benefits to this playground and after-school program were healthier kids. So you ended up with some people really, primarily the kids, caring about this after-school program and their parents. That was the primary. What are we going to do with our kids after school? But the secondary was healthier kids. And what you found was, for example, the local hospital and the health insurance business corporation, they invested in this project because they cared about the common good, the secondary benefits of healthier kids. So the other thing that's different about a WealthWorks value chain is it builds relationships. The flow of information is up and down the value chain. It's among all the players in the value chain, not just people just before you or just after. There's information flow. There's the opportunity to meet your self-interest, but also the mutual benefit. And that is shared. It's not about how do I maximize my money, but actually realizing that when I benefit, someone else can benefit, and it becomes a win-win situation as opposed to win and lose. And then it's managed by a coordinator, somebody who can help these different conversations happen, that is someone who's holding a bigger picture about, are we building wealth? Are we being inclusive? Are we rooting wealth locally in place? So there's a coordinator that's really bringing all these pieces together. Because value chains do not naturally self-organize. WealthWorks builds different forms of wealth. It's intentionally, it's not just sort of accidentally, intentionally focused on how the value chain gets built. You'll see when there's an opportunity facing you, you could do that, meet that opportunity in a couple of different ways. You'll be asking yourselves, am I choosing the best response to this opportunity to create the most wealth or not? That's where those forms of wealth comes into as a planning tool, because you want to make intentional, conscious decisions to increase wealth. And or do no harm to any one of the forms of wealth. It's not always possible to increase every form of wealth, but at least have that intentionality and awareness about an aspiration about not doing harm, if possible. And then also a WealthWorks value chain, because it focuses on building different forms of wealth, it's going to measure impacts in terms of those different forms of wealth. And then I like to say for this last one, it creates relationships that flex. It creates connections, new ideas, political capital that you can apply to other challenges in other sectors. It's why we often say that the social, intellectual, and individual are the foundational pieces economics and the political capital as related to social. They're foundational for any of these value chains, really for any community activity. So building these relationships that flex becomes a great resource for your community going forward. So, okay, we basically understand what a value chain is. There's transactional partners, support partners. So how do we actually use a value chain as a tool to build wealth? And what we do is we map out our system, we map out the value chain, and you'll start to find some gaps. So we make a couple of different definitions. We are specific about these kinds of gaps or opportunities. So one opportunity is when there is a gap. I love, thanks to Ginger for these wonderful diagrams. So here it's clear there's two links in the value chain and there's something missing in between. There's something that has to happen that's not currently happening, or something that needs to be in place that's not currently available. So there would be an opportunity. Well, how do we fill that gap? And how do we do it in a way that builds wealth? So another is there's underutilized resources that can be used to fill the gaps, but also they can be put into productive use in meeting market demand. So just a quick example, the farm to fuel value chain, it'd be very easy to say, oh yes, when you crush the camelina seeds, there's sort of this byproduct, this waste product of meal that's rich in omega-3, but it's just a waste product. But instead they've said, wait a minute, there's another value chain there. How can we use that as feedstock? Or the glycerin that's produced. Who wants glycerin? Well, it turns out the cosmetic industry wants glycerin. So looking at these resources that often are called waste or just sort of left behind, there's an opportunity there to build wealth by how we respond to those underutilized resources. If we leave them and throw them away, we haven't really built any wealth, but there could be an opportunity there. So the next one is about a bottleneck. And so this is what blocks the value chain from operating effectively. So if we can open up, as this cute diagram shows, if you can open up that bottleneck, your product will flow. So there could be different ways to open up that bottleneck that would increase wealth. And then the last one is leverage. What is going to have the biggest impact on the most aspects of your value chain? So you could fill a gap that just suddenly everything will fall into place if you could only fill that gap. That would be a leverage because it has a ripple effect throughout the value chain. It reshapes the entire value chain, as opposed to just one small section which maybe you could work around. So leverage, you only have so many resources, so much time, so much energy. You want to focus on having the biggest impact possible. So you want to focus on your leverage points when you think about a bottleneck or a barrier gap and then using those underutilized resources. So we had examples, sorry. So a gap might be storage. There's no place to have storage. What's interesting with the gap is when you're working in a value chain, instead of just saying, so how am I going to meet my storage needs, you're talking to everyone in the value chain and you're looking for who else has this gap and how you can fill that gap with maybe somebody else. So in this case, they shared an existing storage facility. There's also been examples of partners that have come together that have never worked together before to build a shared storage facility. So filling a gap. A bottleneck might be that there's no expertise in growing the market specifications. This was something that happened also down in the South. So they needed to learn new ways of growing that were more productive and that were growing some new crops that they hadn't really grown before. So that lack of expertise was the bottleneck that was holding up the whole value chain. So by addressing that was a leverage point. The whole value chain could flow. And then a lot of times youth and land are underutilized resources. Being able to engage youth, whether it's labor, this is, obviously from the South as labor, or their ideas and their skills, the value chain is that much stronger because you're using these youth. And then in the South, there was a lot of land that was underutilized, and so they've been able to bring more of that land online by having the youth projects that are starting their own farms and their own production sites. So really looking at, a lot of times people are an underutilized resource. We have people who are unemployed or underemployed, and if we could provide some training or something else, you would be able to bring those folks online. So, okay. So how do we figure this out? Because this is the key to building different forms of wealth. So you pull out your value chain map, and as people on the phone have done this before will tell you, that means that map has been developed over many conversations with many big groups, small groups, one-on-one conversations. It's a learning process. You begin with your map of your value chain, and it's an iterative process. We didn't put it in this PowerPoint, but there's great before and after pictures of value chains, and I know there will be continuing to be new iterations of these value chain maps. But you begin with that map, and you look at what's already in place and what isn't in place. So what are the functions, what are the links in the chain that have to be in place or are not there? And then how could you fill it in a way that would produce multiple forms of wealth at the same time? So a bottleneck, that was the thing that stops us, like a barrier. Sometimes the bottlenecks don't become apparent until you start to actually operate the value chain. So sometimes they're clear at the start. So I don't know if anyone has an example for folks that have been doing this about a bottleneck that you didn't see at the beginning and it showed up as you've explored further. So I'm going to pick like Ellen or Chris or Pamela or Carol, both Chris's. Okay.
No examples of bottlenecks, really.
Okay.
I think we're at a bottleneck.
All right.
This is Chris. I'll talk a little bit about bottlenecks and gaps. I guess the three, focusing on the bottlenecks. And enterprise, it's a very small community, and one of the challenges that they've faced for a while is basically volunteerism or staff capacity to help carry out local work plans that have been developed over the years for the downtown.
Muted.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello? Okay. So, we've been facilitating these stakeholder meetings to bring members of different sectors within the community, including a Main Street group that was established by the Oregon Main Street program, the city who originally brought us in to help
Unmuted.
town and identify priorities, which include focusing on the OK Theater, which is what we're doing our WealthWorks around, and merchants in the downtown to talk about ways that we can bring value-added business opportunities around the theater. And we've been talking with the Economic Development District to really try and break down some of the barriers. Actually, it comes down to, in some cases, individuals within the community and previous history and differences of opinions. So, in that case, I would say that some of the individual dynamics have created barriers to moving some things forward, not the theater, but other things that they've been wanting to work on, and it's kind of affected some of the dynamic. The theater's going great, and that's really what we're focusing on for WealthWorks. So that's what I got to share.
Great.
Great. Great. So maybe finish this slide. So then there's underutilized resources. And you start to, and I imagine, Chris, that in your process, you've found some underutilized resources as you've gone through mapping sort of around the theater and then downtown, Main Street, the enterprises. I'm sure that there's been, or the businesses, that there's been some underutilized resources that have come up.
Yeah, absolutely. The youth entrepreneurship program associated with the school, who we hope to tap into more, the community action agency that serves low-income populations in the local region. I'd say that the Economic Development District is somewhat of an underutilized resource for the city of Enterprise. They do a lot of work in the local region, but part of our role was to come in and help stakeholders focus more on Enterprise in the downtown.
Okay. Cool. So by looking at the whole picture through the value chain map and starting to get creative thinking about what, even intentional about asking that question, what underutilized resources do we have that we're not using, it starts to create possibilities and opportunities. And I think for me that's what's most exciting about this approach, is that it really creates new opportunities and innovation versus just doing things the same way because we've always talked to this one business and that's who we talk to, is just that one business. And I think it helps businesses as well start to see the resources in their communities. Okay.
Great.
So I'm not sure if we should, I don't know, I feel like we've been talking a lot, or I've been talking. Okay. So before Shauna starts, I want to check about the question box. I think if you look at your panel, you will see the word questions. And if you click on that, it will open up the question box.
Muted. Unmuted.
I muted everybody. Now I can, because people heard a lot of background noise. But if you can't find the question box, then you kind of need to be unmuted. All right. Well, it was just trying to do a quick technical thing. I think we're all right. Okay. You should go ahead, Shauna.
Okay. All right. So,
can you hear me?
yes.
Ah, there we go.
This is Carol. I have just had trouble unmuting myself, so I apologize. You know, just before we go any further,
Sure.
I wanted to add or ask the question back regarding gaps as opportunities. And I think that when we did the value chain, and as we're doing it in Green River around nature-based tourism and looking at those different sectors, one thing that we're really finding so far is the gaps that we have in that tourism infrastructure can be turned into opportunities, whether they're expansion of present businesses or creation of new businesses.
Absolutely. And one of the ways to think about the gaps is exactly the way you're doing it, as entrepreneurial opportunities.
Yeah, I actually see gaps, bottlenecks, and underutilized resources all as opportunities. Mm-hmm. They're opportunities to for people and to make your value chain be even more effective. So I know sometimes gaps sort of has maybe a negative term, but a gap is totally an opportunity. You think about the farm to fuel, they're creating a whole community of businesses have been created in that value chain because there's all these different steps that have to happen around the camelina crop and or the waste oil. And so in that case, they're building a community of businesses. So, and a bottleneck can be an opportunity too, to build skills, to it's not just removing a barrier, it's actually addressing a need in your value chain. So
right, and I think about that I think it was in Fahi's value chain of energy efficiency, and they needed to train energy efficient raters or folks who had those skill sets to train others in the community. So they were able to look at that gap and turn it into an opportunity. So I agree, and I just thought it was worth bringing up that distinction.
Good.
I want to say another word about bottlenecks too, I think, before we move on, which is one way to think about bottlenecks as inefficiencies in the value chain. So if, for example, you have a lot of small growers, but they can't get their product together, they can't aggregate it, that might be a gap, but it's also a bottleneck. It's preventing them from moving forward. So it's not just a matter of finding an aggregator. It's a matter of making sure that that aggregator is functioning as efficiently as possible, right? So that the value chain can really realize all the benefits as it possibly can for the people who participate in it. So when I think about bottlenecks, I often think about them in terms of inefficiencies. And that may be a different lens to look at it through that might help you identify some.
That's great.
And I think it's one other thing I want to say too about this slide. We won't go into depth in the stories, but if you look under rural action, you'll see that there were many, many gaps in that value chain when they started to look to their work on it. And they have had to fill many gaps in order to get to the point of recognizing where the highest leverage is. So in any value chain, you can't just focus on the high leverage places. You need to address everything and pay attention and look for those high leverage places. It's not either or. As we say so often in this work, it's not either or, it's and. Right? So every functional gap has to be filled for the value chain to work, and some gaps or some opportunities may be very high leverage. Typically the ones that are the highest leverage are the ones that have to do with connecting to demand and really being able to restructure your value chain to better serve and better capture demand. Okay, so how do we get from exploration to proof of concept? What is that really all about? So the first thing is that it takes work, right? It takes practices. And so there's a practice that begins with identifying an opportunity sector and a product. And then there's the practice of exploring the market potential and anchor demand and talking about what you are going to ask your buyers. We covered a little bit earlier how you're going to get to know their value propositions and their pain points. And then you're actually into constructing a WealthWorks value chain that operates and brings goods and services to market and at the same time creates multiple forms of wealth and delivers revenue back through the value chain. We think about WealthWorks as taking place in basically 4 phases. The exploration phase is where you begin to identify the opportunity sector, and you begin to have conversations with potential buyers and with the transactional players to really understand what they do now, what they can do, where the gaps really are in the community or region that need to be filled, how you're going to engage with economically marginalized people and places, and set this up so they can actually benefit from the value chain as it gets built out. So exploration begins to answer lots and lots of questions and then gets you to the point where you can say, well, is this particular value chain idea feasible? Does it make sense? Should we go ahead and try to prove the concept, or should we begin to look in another sector or with another set of goods and services that might be more promising? The second stage of this work is what we call proof of concept, which is where you really build the value chain. It becomes operational. So when the group in the South was able to sell $50,000 worth of product in their first year, that was proving a concept. It wasn't their goal to have sales of only $50,000 in their value chain forever and ever, but it was a way to start and prove that in fact they could work together, they could produce products that the market wanted, and they could benefit together from their efforts. And so that's what we mean by proof of concept. You know you've proved the concept when the value chain partners are operating together to produce a good or service that's actually being purchased in the market, and they're getting relationships and feedback from the market about how to even improve that good or service, how to spread it further, new people in the market that might be interested in it. That's the proof of concept stage. Step 3 is the implementation stage, or what we call building to scale. So once your value chain has been proven, then the question is, how are you going to get it to scale? What does it take? You might need more transactional partners. You might need your transactional partners to grow. You might need more support partners and different kinds of support partners to grow effectively. You may need to bring investors in that were not available to you until you could prove your concept. One of the key pieces of proof of concept, by the way, is to engage potential investors at that stage so they can tell you what you need to prove to them for them to be interested in helping you in stage 3, helping you actually build to scale. So that's really where your conversation with investors can begin, at proof of concept. And then they can come into play to help you build to scale. And then the fourth phase in this work we call institutionalization. And by institutionalization we mean when the value chain is so embedded in the way that, in the new normal, in the way business is done, embedded by the buyers, embedded by the transactional players, embedded by the support players, so that it no longer depends on a local champion or a particular individual who's a buyer and enthusiastic, but rather their whole organization has bought into it. One of the examples of institutionalization that I sometimes use is from a financial services organization, a credit union in Massachusetts. When we asked them this question, they said, well, we used to offer financial literacy training, but it was only because one staff person was really enthusiastic about it. He put the program together, he ran the program, and if he had left or taken another job, we would not have continued that program. But the program was so successful that the institution made a commitment to continue it, which meant they wrote it into their budget, they trained a number of staff people in how to carry out the program, and it became simply the way they do business. And then if that person who championed it was to leave or take another job, that program would still continue at that institution. It had been institutionalized, so to speak. So that's what we mean by institutionalization, and that's the ultimate goal of this work, is to change systems and create a new normal so that things are really different for many people at scale. A value chain exploration, which is the training that we've been offering, begins again with this selecting the WealthWorks value chain, mapping it the way you've seen some of the maps in their early stages, exploring, as I discussed, identifying the gaps, the bottlenecks, the underutilized resources, and the opportunities that flow from those things, designing interventions to build multiple forms of wealth while you're fixing the gaps, filling the gaps, fixing the bottlenecks, and engaging the underutilized resources, and then bringing the stakeholders together to say, do we have something here? Is this something that we want to really move into proof of concept? When you get ready to move into proof of concept, and I know that several folks on this webinar have had questions about, well, so now what? We've done our exploration. What do we do next? First thing you need to do is choose a demand partner that you're going to work with in your proof of concept. And maybe it's more than one demand partner. But you and that partner need to agree that you are going to commit together to going through this proof of concept. So it needs to be a partner who really sees their self-interest in helping this value chain succeed, because it's going to help them achieve their goals. Then what you're going to do is work with your demand partner to carefully define the products and services that your value chain is going to deliver to that partner, that need to be in place in order for this to actually work and meet the needs of that partner. So for example, if you have a demand partner on the tourism side, you want to know who is that partner serving, what kinds of experiences do they want to provide, what kinds of equipment and dining and lodging and interpretive services are going to be required to make this an outstanding experience for their customers, and how is your value chain going to organize to deliver that? That leads you to determining the right set of transactional partners for proof of concept, and as Barbara said, you don't bring in the supporting partners until you know who the transactional partners are, because the supporting partners will have a tendency to offer what they always offer and try to bring things around to what it is they're good at offering. And it's not that's not necessarily where you want to focus. You want to focus on what are the transactional partners need in order to meet this, the needs of this demand partner. Do they need financing? Do they need technical assistance? Do they need someone to come out and help them figure out how to do a better job with interpretation? Do they need hospitality training? Once you know what they really need, then you can find the right supporting partners to deliver it, and you can work with the supporting partners to make sure that they are, as Barbara said, also demand-driven, that what they're delivering is, in fact, what the transactional partners really need. Then you're in a position, as you develop, as you begin to think about your proof of concept, to identify potential investors, because you have an understanding then of what the gaps are you're trying to fill, what the bottlenecks are you're trying to address, who you've got for transactional and supporting partners, and where investment's going to be required to move this forward. Some of those investors are likely to be people right next door, people in your region, in your community, who are looking for ways to support a stronger local economy but haven't really seen those venues. And so often we're finding that as value chain coordinators begin to recognize investment opportunities, they can find responsive potential investors close to home who just have never had a really good concrete opportunity to invest in their own community in ways where they can visualize what the return on that investment is going to look like. And then you need to work together. Right? This is not a process that takes place in a vacuum. People need to work together to design the value chain, to implement it, to document it, and then to learn as you go along and to adjust and figure out how to get better. So it's not a particularly mysterious process, but it does mean really beginning with that demand partner. So how do you go about engendering investment? What do we even kind of mean by investment in value chains? I think the best way to start thinking about investment in value chains is to think about who would benefit if the value chain that you're envisioning were fully functioning. If it were up and running, not at a proof of concept level, but fully up and running at scale, who would benefit from it? And often the answers are somewhat surprising. So, for example, one of the places that we ran into in doing this work was a company in the South that was having a very hard time attracting a labor force to their community because it simply wasn't seen as a desirable place to live. They would benefit from a value chain that helped the most disadvantaged folks in their community be more productive and began to support the amenities that those folks would benefit from, because it would make the whole community more inviting and a better place, and it would make it easier for them to attract employees. So even though they weren't necessarily interested in the particular value chain under consideration, they were very interested in being able to point to a more vibrant economy. And they had resources that they could bring to bear to help make that happen. So if you think more broadly about who would benefit if your value chain were up and running, then you can begin to identify who some of the unlikely potential investors might be. Second thing to recognize is that investment doesn't have to mean money. It can mean expertise or materials. It can mean changing policies to support the value chain. So if a tourism agency says, we have had a policy of only stopping at communities that, fit with a population of 50,000 or more, but we're willing to change that policy to stop in your community, even though it's smaller, because we've worked with you to develop this very special offering, and we think that it will be great for us and great for you. That's a form of investment, that willingness to change policies to support the value chain. It's also a form of expertise. I can't remember right now. I apologize. This might have even been Chris in Enterprise, but I remember that one of you had a hospital that stepped forward and said, we're willing to help have the marketing expertise that we have in-house work with your value chain, because we recognize that if your value chain succeeds, it will be good for us as well. And then the next question you need to ask is, what does your value chain actually have to offer to investors? So investors are looking for a return on their investment. Again, that doesn't have to be a financial return. It can be a return in terms of the benefits to their organization or to their business. It can be a return, a psychic return, in understanding that you've contributed to your community and you want to be able to feel good about that. It can be a return in terms of other forms of wealth that are being developed. Perhaps your value chain is creating built wealth that can benefit more than one party, and there can be an investor who's going to benefit from that built capital. So there are any number of ways to think about that, but it's important to think about what your value chain is offering to investors. So again, you're not just saying, we have this great idea, will you help us, but you're saying, what's in this for you? Back to the old value proposition concept. These are a couple of resources on financing that have been developed through WealthWorks. One is on financing the evolving role of the value chain coordinator, and really thinking about how that role can evolve and who would have a self-interest in supporting that role. And the second one is a guide to crowdfunding for WealthWorks value chains. And there are also, there's at least one webinar available on that. If any of you are interested, we can try to get you the links to that webinar as well. But these are two really excellent resources to help you think about this question of investment. And now we're going to talk a little bit about roles. We've been talking, as we've gone through this webinar, about coordinators and the importance of having a value chain coordinator. As Barbara mentioned, value chains don't self-organize. And worse than that, typically the part of the reason that we don't make more progress in our efforts of community and economic development is that it's no one's job to coordinate. It's no one's job to connect the dots, particularly if the dots are non-conventional, right? If you're bringing hospitals together with farmers, that may not be something that's been done before, and building those relationships takes time and effort. And if it's no one's job, it tends just not to happen. So this work begins with a coordinator. It needs a coordinator to start. That coordinator sometimes can be in the private sector, and that's great, and then you don't necessarily need to raise money to support them. But sometimes they're in the nonprofit sector or the public sector, and there is a need to raise some money to support that function, at least until the value chain becomes totally self-supporting. So what does a coordinator do? A coordinator, first and foremost, is a wealth-building advocate. They understand what WealthWorks is about. They understand the importance of building these stocks of wealth and paying attention to doing no harm as we're building them. And they're really an advocate for this way of thinking about development. Secondly, they're a big picture holder. They see the entire value chain from beginning to end. They can envision the gaps, the bottlenecks, the players, the opportunities, and they're not distracted by just one small part of the chain. They really keep the entire chain in mind all the time. They are the connector and the convener. They're the one responsible for connecting those dots, building those relationships, helping everyone in the chain understand what's in it for everyone else, and find their shared interest as well as their self-interest. They are often the innovator, or at least the spark, the place to come to discuss innovation. So in their role as convener, they can facilitate other people's innovative ideas as well, and thinking about collectively about problem solving in new and different ways. Thinking about this question of actually creating market demand. What would that look like? What are the innovations that would require? They are mediators. So clearly, whenever we're working together as human beings, we run into places where we misunderstand each other or where there are issues or conflicts that arise. So the value chain coordinator is in part a mediator. And they're a data aggregator. They are the group or the person that starts to say, what's the information that we need to have to know what the impacts are that we're having? How can that information be helpful to people in the chain? And then how can we aggregate it to tell our story and to become even more influential as we go through this and grow to scale? There's another role that's very important in this work, and that's the role of coach. And some of you on this call are going to be playing the role of coordinator or are already playing it, and some of you are already playing the role of coach, or that will be something that you will be taking up. So some of the critical things a coach does is hold the big picture of WealthWorks. So the value chain coordinator's job is to hold the big picture of the value chain, to really understand all the moving parts in the value chain and how they can work together, how that working can be shaped and smoothed and made more effective. The coach's role is to hold the big picture of WealthWorks as a framework, as a set of principles, as a set of tools and practices, so that the coach can help steer the coordinator in their efforts to bring a WealthWorks value chain into being, and can help remind them of this component or this tool or that tool as that becomes appropriate. As we often say, this is a kind of like peeling an onion. So there are concepts inherent in WealthWorks that people may grab onto right away, and that's fantastic. And there are others that may not become compelling until you're down the road in the workaways. So the coach's job is to hold on to all those concepts so that he or she can know when best to introduce them, when they're actually going to make sense, when they're actually going to be compelling for the folks doing the work on the ground. It's also the coach's role to focus on results and to try to help the coordinator maintain a focus on results and not get so deep into the nuts and bolts that focus on results slides a little bit. It's the coach's role to provide time for reflection so that the coordinator and some of the other players in the value chain who can benefit from the coach can say, hey, we really have come a long way. We really have done these things. Look at that. We're in a different place than we were 3 months ago or 6 months ago. I wonder where we'll be 3 months from now. What can we learn from what we've achieved so far that can help us get even further? It's the coach's role to connect with resources. So a group decides that they really need some hospitality training is one of those things that needs to be added to the value chain. Who would be good at that? Who's available in the region to provide that service? A coach can be very helpful in helping to figure out what resources are available to a value chain and even vet those resources to a degree so that you're sure that what you're offering comes in line with what the value chain can really use. And finally, while it's not the coach's job to solve the problems of the value chain, a coach can be very helpful in helping problem solve and beginning to think about, well, I'm listening to you and you're telling me you're stuck. What are some ideas for getting unstuck? And the coordinator may have their own ideas and the coach may have some ideas. And that's part of what a coach can do is share thinking about, this is how I've seen other people approach that problem, or these are some resources that might be helpful to you in getting unstuck, or have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? So those are some of the roles, and there certainly are other roles a coach can play as well, but these are some key ones that I think Barbara and I both as coaches have found ourselves playing, and we know that other people play these roles as well. So just to begin to bring this webinar to its close and open it up for more questions and discussion, we thought it would be useful to review the guiding principles of WealthWorks, many of which we've now talked about, and you can see them all kind of together in one place. The first principle is that WealthWorks is demand-driven, and that makes it really quite materially different from many of the other kinds of community and economic development activities that you and others have participated in the past. WealthWorks is intentionally inclusive. It's inclusive of people and places that have been economically marginalized. And that's because we believe that poverty is a function of isolation. It's a function of being cut off from the opportunities to participate meaningfully in the mainstream economy. And WealthWorks is designed to create those opportunities. So it's intentionally inclusive. One could create value chains that were quite successful that were not intentionally inclusive. And so that's a really core principle for WealthWorks. WealthWorks ties wealth to place through value chains, and hopefully now you have some sense of what we mean when we say a value chain. WealthWorks integrates outcome measurement as a tool for planning and adaptive management, and also, as Barbara said, as a tool for assessment. But measurement is important to WealthWorks. We need to know whether or not we're making difference, and we need to understand whether or not we're doing harm. And really, it's not part of our DNA here in the United States to think a lot about impacts. We tend to think more about activities. When we do think about impacts, we don't tend to think about them in a systems framework. And so this is really, we're using measurement as a tool to heighten our ability to think in systems and to really look to see where we're having positive impacts, where we could accelerate those positive impacts, where we might be having negative impacts that we need to figure out how to moderate. WealthWorks makes wealth stick through attention to structures of ownership and control. We haven't talked a lot about that on this webinar, but the idea is that ownership matters. Control matters. If you invest in a WealthWorks value chain and built capital is created, but that built capital is not owned or controlled by people in the value chain and by people who depend on the value chain for livelihood, then the owner of that built capital can decide to tear it down, or can decide to move it someplace else, or can decide to change its focus in ways that are detrimental to the value chain. So we want to be sure when value chains are built that the ownership and control of key assets in that chain reside with the people who that chain is engaging and who are intended to benefit from it. And there are many structures of ownership and control that can help do that. And then the final principle, very important to understand, is that WealthWorks is a framework. It's strategically flexible. The real aspirational bottom line is to do no harm to any of the forms of wealth while you're putting WealthWorks into work for you. But it's not a straitjacket, and it's not a cookie cutter. It's a framework and a set of strategies that are designed to be flexible in response to the specific opportunities that each unique place offers and that the demand side of each value chain offers. So let's open it up to questions. We have about 20 minutes or so. The last slide simply gives you some contact information for myself and for Barbara, and also 3 websites that have information about WealthWorks. But we would love to be able to answer questions. I know that there were some questions typed out, and if you'd like to unmute yourself and let us know what they are, that would be great.
And everyone should be unmuted by now, so everyone. I don't know. I know, Ellen, that it seemed like you had a question. I'm not sure we answered it in the process, or if you still have a question, we'd love to hear it. Maybe she's not there.
Some of the folks who are just hearing this for the first time, we'd be surprised if you didn't have some questions. So feel free to chime in. There are no silly questions.
This is Carol. May I just make a comment question?
Sure.
One of the things that I think that has just been so interesting and keeps coming up in all the work that we're doing in Green River is we're constantly asking ourselves, do we have the right people in the room? And do we have the right people in the room? We'll conclude a meeting, we'll say, who else needs to be here? And I think constantly asking that question to make sure that we do have the right partners is so important, because when we first started, we cast such a wide net. We tried to capture everyone, and in the point we are now, we've had some attrition, people have fallen out, and hopefully we've got the right people in the room now. But Barbara, when you talked about the the relationship between transactional partners and supporting partners, and you really said that transactional partners must be identified first before supporting partners. I thought that was really an interesting point, because I had not heard that before, but it's true. And it makes things easier if you look at it that way. Great. So I appreciate you saying that today.
Great.
And this is Pam. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
You know, and I think another thing that you said, Barbara, that is so true is that the value chain is an ongoing process. That I think what Chris has found in Enterprise is that every meeting that he has with that group, the value chain will change because of the transactional partners or the support partners, and so once you set up the value chain, it does not stay stagnant. It is a document, and I think what Chris and I decided is with his meetings, opening up the meeting with the current value chain, and then as you close the meeting, make the changes that were identified as the work moves on. So I thought that was a great comment. So thank you.
It's a great point, and we often talk about the fact that the exploration phase, that phase of the first of the four that we laid out, doesn't ever really end. The further you get in constructing a value chain, improving it, and bringing it to scale, and institutionalizing it, the more problems there are to solve, the more you learn, the more opportunities you see. Other folks?
Even just think like, wow, what didn't make sense from everything I just heard? Like, what don't I get? Like, this is crazy. If there's any that can lead to a question or just a clarification if there's something that's stumping you.
This is Richard. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good. Looks like my mute just came off. So first of all, this is my first exposure. I mean, I've heard a little bit about WealthWorks from a couple sources, but I'm just getting to know it. So I love it, and I appreciate what you've got to offer. The only comment I really am, or question I kind of have, is I was fascinated by the thought that what you were pointing out is that value chains don't self-organize, and I see that, and I know from our work in Mora that it's so important to have somebody that is a mover, a champion, that has a vision, has some sort of direction that they want to move in, that it needs to be part of a group of people that come together. It's got to be beyond a concept that you're trying to enroll people in. It's got to in some way be building on the people that are right there. What do you have to say about that?
Richard, I had a little trouble hearing all of that, but what I think I heard, and let me know if I got it wrong, is how important it is to have a champion.
Yes, that's right. And how does that relate to the self-organizing, not self-organizing kind of dynamic?
Well, I think that absolutely true, that to get this work jump-started, someone has to believe in it and have the vision and have the dedication to begin to take the risks. Because this isn't risk-free, this is change, right? There are risks involved. And someone has to be willing to go out there, step outside their comfort zone, talk to new people, build relationships, and test some things out. That is very much the role of a coordinator and a coordinating group, and something that that coaches can be really helpful in supporting. I think that once the relationships are formed and a value chain gets up and running, it can, if it's doing well, it can become over time, at least we hope and think it can, relatively self-sufficient. So the role of that coordinator can change from the beginning, when they really need to be the one that's connecting the initial dots and letting people meet each other and even find their shared interests and connect and define their self-interests, to the point where they're actually working together and it becomes routine for them to work together. They may not need that ongoing presence of the champion nearly as much. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
I would also just add, I think that coordinators really sort of this insider-outsider, coordinators come from the community. Coordinators are the champions in the community. But what happens, right, is that these are some new ideas. These are, people really haven't thought this way. I do a ton of work in West Virginia, and my partners and I, our favorite expression is, you don't know what you don't know. So perhaps in the beginning there's a meeting, a workshop, some exposure and then coordinators or champions start to see where that fits, what fits for them, how it fits, how it could work, and then they start to emerge. And I've really learned this from you guys at RCAC. I saw Chris and Carol and others, but start as that coordinator until community members started to go, oh, we see this, we want to do it. This is a new idea, but we see how it applies here. And then you saw those coordinators from the community start to emerge. So it's just like in all community economic development, there's a striking a balance between introducing new ideas and then seeing how they land and who picks up on it, or if it gets picked up on. So it's a dance. For me, it's a dance between different community champions or outside voice. But ultimately, the coordinator is the community champion. And the other thing, I think Shauna Maya said it, but we're really clear. Coordinators are really teams of people usually. I mean, there might be one person or organization that plays a role in sort of keeping all the pieces together, calling meetings or whatever, but no one organization builds all forms of wealth. Everyone comes with different expertise. So coordinators tend to be a team of people working together. While there might be one person who says, all right, I'll take care of calling the meetings and handling the budget or whatever, but it's rare that one person is the coordinator, even though we say the coordinator, because it's easier language-wise.
So I want to say one other thing. We didn't talk about it very much in this webinar, but WealthWorks has also always been a kind of a vision for regional development that involves rural-urban connections. So in that way, it's different from conventional community development where you're really looking at one geographic community. This is really not organized around a community. It's organized around a value chain. And the demand partner for your value chain is likely, if you're in a small rural community, not to be in your community. They may be a tourist from away, or tourists from away. They may be buyers from away. They may be in an urban area in your region, or they may be outside your region entirely. And so they are also important members of your value chain. And so when you think about who you're engaging and how those connections are made and the scope of the value chain, it can be very, very liberating, I think, for people in small communities to begin to connect with buyers who have a worldview that's perhaps very different from theirs and can help them understand the value that they have to bring to the table.
So, Shauna, Blanca has a question. Hers is, how long does it take for a value chain to work from conception to implementation? More or less, what is the time frame?
Great question. I would say that obviously it varies and it's different, but we've seen that it takes roughly 9 months to a year to do a pretty good thorough exploration, to really understand what the potential is for a given value chain within a given sector, in a given place, connected with certain kinds of buyers, to really make a difference and take off. And then it can take, and it doesn't mean that during that year you're not necessarily beginning to move into proof of concept. You may be, but you're still fundamentally focused on exploring. Then I would say it takes a year or two to develop proof of concept. And during proof of concept, again, you're beginning to move to implementation, beginning potentially to move to scale. And then institutionalization happens at different rates for different value chains and for different components of value chains. So we've seen some components of value chains that have gone to institutionalization within, say, 3 years, and we've seen others that, that have taken longer and will take longer. But I would say that we've been able to see on the ground some pretty significant results from this approach within a couple of years, right? Enough for people to then say, boy, there's something here, we really need to keep moving with this. And so I hope that helps.
And I would just also add, it can seem slow in the beginning, but it's really because you're really creating a new system. You're creating that transformational change, not just sort of responding with a flow, not responding with just a quick response. It's bigger than that, but then it's more long-lasting. And I was just talking to Tammy from Arkansas, and they're really at that point where they've done their proof of concept, and they're getting ready to go to scale, and it's taken a while to get here, but now, she said, it's going to go so fast in the communities where they're replicating, because they've really gotten all the pieces in the system together, and they've worked out so many they've filled gaps, they've identified bottlenecks, they've created opportunities to fill those, to respond to those bottlenecks. So now it's like all been figured out, and it's just going to roll out in these other communities. But they had to really change the system before, because it's the new normal, as Shauna said, and that takes time. But once you get there, it actually is almost faster than a series of starts and stops and white elephants and things that worked fine for a little bit but don't work anymore, because it really has, the time has been put up front in the testing.
And just to put Barbara's story in context, from beginning to end, they've been working on this for about 3 years. So when we're talking about significant systems change, I would suggest to you that's not very long.
So in terms of the timeline, one thing that I've been thinking about in the last few months, as we've been working through this, is when you go into a community, if you were to use this, this model again, this tool, what are those ingredients for success? I mean, how can you, if you had a menu of 5 different communities that you can work in, what would be that lowest hanging fruit that you would want to say, okay, this community is more ready? What are those ingredients for readiness that would make this model, I guess, more easy to work through or more viable?
I would say one would be open-mindedness, simply the willingness to entertain new ideas and new ways of thinking and working. Some communities have that, other communities really don't.
Shauna, there's a couple more questions. I'm going to go back to Blanca, and then Elizabeth has a question. So Blanca's question related to this proof of concept is, what does the proof of concept entail? Is there a business plan in this stage?
Yes. So proof of concept begins typically during the exploration phase. Once you've decided that you actually have an idea worth pursuing, usually concludes with some kind of a feasibility study and or an economic impact study or something that gives you a sense of the scope and scale that is achievable and what the pieces are that need to be paid attention to get there. Then you're really talking about putting the building blocks in place one by one, right? And where there may well be a business plan required to fill a particular gap in the chain. So, for example, in Central Appalachia, in the wood products chain, they had to develop a wood brokerage from scratch. That required an entire business plan. It's required developing a website and developing a sales force and a whole lot of pieces. It's been developing a business that didn't exist before in order to plug a gap in the value chain. In the case that Barbara was talking about with Tammy, they have had to figure out how to manufacture micro processors for biofuel, and that's been another whole piece of work. In the process of the developing energy efficient housing, Poppy in Central Appalachia had to do research to figure out how you get the most bang for your buck in the way you construct housing. So in other words, what's the system that needs to be used so you get the most energy efficiency for the least investment consistently? And they had to design a construction process that they could replicate and that would work. So The steps in proof of concept are many and varied, but they certainly do include feasibility, business planning, and more than that as well.
And then Elizabeth's question was, I understand the gap definitions for underutilized resources and bottleneck. Could you explain further on leverage and provide some examples?
Sure. So leverage are those interventions that are likely to move the value chain most significantly. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In the housing value chain, as they were developing, filling all the gaps with training the people to measure energy efficiency at homes and putting construction crews in place and, excuse me, all the other things that needed doing, they discovered that the bottleneck to market-driven change was the fact that appraisers weren't appraising energy-efficient housing any differently than they were appraising standard housing, non-energy efficient housing. And energy-efficient housing costs a little bit more to construct, although it has a very quick payback because you're reducing your energy costs substantially. But in order to be able to pay that additional amount up front, the appraisers have to recognize that the house has more value. Turns out that there is a way for them to do that. It didn't require a big change in policy, but it did require retraining. When the value chain coordinator recognized that bottleneck and was able to fund training for appraisers, now, because the appraisers are saying the house is worth more, not only is it worth more to the low-income owner, thereby increasing their wealth and their assets, but the bank will pay for the house to be constructed in the first place without the need for subsidy. So this is changing a system that went from the reliance on subsidy for low-income housing to a system that doesn't rely on subsidy and produces a highly energy-efficient house. So that was a high-leverage change because it's going to allow thousands and thousands more houses to be constructed than could ever have been constructed from subsidy alone. So that's an example of changing the relationship of the value chain to the marketplace in such a way that the market begins to support it as opposed to it having to be supported through subsidy. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does.
So this is Richard. I got another question.
Sure.
You had said in the beginning that this is going to be recorded. I'm looking to re-access this, both the audio part and the visuals. I was wondering if the visuals you use as well as the auditory is accessible, and how do I get there?
Yes, it will be, and we will send you guys out information on that once we're done.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Great. Well, I don't see any more questions in the question box. I'm glad we found that. But there's no more in there. I don't know if anyone else has questions that they want to just ask.
I would just like to say thank you so very much for putting this together and providing this information to the RCAC staff and the community folks that we work with. We really appreciate this, and it's been very informative. So thank you both, Barbara and Shauna.
You're very welcome. And we look forward to continuing a relationship and hearing about the great work that you guys are doing.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.